If you don't want to be recorded, then please turn your camera off. But we're looking forward to um, making sure that this is available to others that are participating in the design charrette. So we really want to appreciate Vivek for giving us his time today. He's an amazing thought leader, and appreciate his collaboration and sharing his time and his research and knowledge with us. All right, Vivek.
All right. Thanks so much, Heather, and thanks to Architectural Heritage Center for the invitation to come and talk a little bit about work I've been engaging with. For those of you who don't know me, I'm here in Northeast Portland and have been in Portland for since the 90s. I am a transplant here from other parts of the world and country, and have really grown fond of the Pacific Northwest in the last 30-ish years that I've been here. And one of the things that I have found about living in the city of Portland is the incredible interest in wanting to do city making. It's a place that has had an urban growth boundary for one of the longest in the country. It's had an enormous amount of civic infrastructure set up for doing engagement work, and is really a privilege to be able to participate in conversations like this one with you all. In my day job, I wear a hat as a professor of geography at Portland State University. I serve on the city's Sustainability and Climate Commission, Metro's Bond Oversight Committee, the National Urban and Community Forestry Advisory Council, and several others that I don't have time to get into, but been in this space of environment and climate and city making for a good portion of my 20 years at Portland State. And just want to share a few thoughts with you, more or less to provoke you in thinking about preparing for the upcoming design charrette. There's some new data points to be thinking about, new ideas or old ideas in maybe new ways that I'm going to try to represent today. I just want to start, maybe if you can see my screen, with just my own positioning in this work. I like to just
I don't think you can see your screen. You're not sharing yet.
Oh, I'm not sharing it. Oh, interesting. Did I lose it? Let me try here. Does this work?
There you go. I think that's working. Perfect.
Okay. So I'll actually.
Oh, we lost it.
Oh, weird. How is this happening here? When I switch slides, I seem to be losing my screen. How's this?
That looks good.
Okay, I will just go from here then. Hopefully I won't lose it here. So that introduction, I'd just like to make this statement about my own privilege of participating in conversations like this. I, as an able-bodied cisgender male who through no direct agency of my own, found myself in a supportive family structure after birth, and whose parents nurtured my physical development, provided economic support, and encouraged my intellectual and spiritual interests. These early and ongoing privileges are the foundations that expanded the suite of opportunities that allow me to engage with you today. I really see this as something that is important for me to recognize all the folks who've come before me, as well as those who have kind of helped craft the narrative that I'm going to kind of try to present to you today, and for us to really think seriously about as we think about resiliency in an era of rapid climate transformation. I have a lot of inspiration that I draw from various different places. One of the most classic city planners that I know in this space is someone who I draw a lot of inspiration from, and it's none other than her one and only Janet Jackson, who, if you might remember, in the 80s came out with a pop hit that just really got me interested in this field of urban planning. And it was "What Have Urban Designs Done For Me Lately?" If you've heard that pop hit, you can find it on all kinds of locations. And it's one of those moments of inspiration where I see that the city is really providing many different facets, especially in its design, for my health and well-being. And so, jokes aside, I want to touch on this notion of resilience before I go any further in terms of framing the overall conversation today. So I would start just quickly by identifying resilience as having three components, among others. The first is recognizing historical context, and that really harkens to this idea of places and communities hold a collective trauma. There is in every place a history. There are layers and layers of history in a place, and recognizing that history and in many ways honoring and lifting up that history is a big part of our ability to be resilient, because ultimately this land and this planet is the most resilient system we know. Second is this aspect of being able to respond effectively to extreme events. And whether we're talking about climate change or a event that of losing a job or finding yourself unhoused, these are all extreme events, and finding ways to cope and rebound from those pressures. And in my particular area of interest, those pressures from a warming planet is really at the core of the kind of work that I'm interested in talking with you about. And then finally, this third piece around seeing oneself within a community. That's a third dimension of what we might really consider as what it means to be resilient, and that is engaging in a civic discourse about the future of place and people. I'm going to try doing this one more time and seeing if this full screen will work. If I lose it, then I might stop and go back to what I had. Can you still see this? I don't know if I can see you though. Let's see. No, lost it. Okay, I may have to stop. I may have to not be able to share my screen then. At least in full screen mode. I will keep it as this. Hopefully you can see this still. So these three components of resilience are really at the core of the kind of work that I'm seeing important in city making. It's this place, it's these events, and it's this community, right? That framework really helps me orient around how we think about urban design, how we think about changes in the built environment, and what it means for us to be able to respond effectively. So in terms of historical context, I want to use that framework to kind of go through just a few examples and I'll be only speaking for another about 20 minutes or so, because I do want to get to a discussion about some of these topics that I'm going to bring up. An area where we've spent considerable amount of time is looking at how history of place, and in this case, looking at policies around segregation that have been long-standing around the world and in the US in the form of maps that were designed in the 1930s through the 1960s that essentially codified specific neighborhoods as A, B, C, and D. Those were grades that were given to these neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods were either backed by federal mortgages through the Homeowners Loan Corporation or the Federal Housing Administration. And what we observed, even though these policies, these segregation policies, were abolished in the 1960s through a number of civil rights acts, what we see today in the neighborhoods that were disinvested, in this case in the letter D here versus the letter A, this is just showing a simple graph of tree canopy and impervious surface. Impervious surface is those hardened areas, asphalt, concrete, generally speaking. And what we're seeing here is a distribution of that in relation to what we would cast as a long shadow from these policies. So today's the neighborhoods that were graded as D in the 1930s have orders of magnitude more impervious surface, asphalt, than they do have tree canopy. Whereas those neighborhoods that were deemed as, quote, desirable or the best neighborhoods in the 1930s today have more tree canopy than impervious surface. That's not just by coincidence. It really was a very clear signal that we were able to pick up on in this 2020 paper that we wrote, where we were looking at 108 cities across the country and looking at these relationships. And so that really suggests that, when you disinvest in a neighborhood over time, what ends up happening is that land value essentially gets depressed. So there's fewer parks, there's fewer social services, there's fewer amenities in that neighborhood by design, by not necessarily nefarious acts or anything like that. It's much more along the lines of those neighborhoods just didn't receive much funding from the 1930s through the 1960s because of a lot of segregation and other policies. And what ended up happening was those land areas and the land rent and the land values were suppressed. And therefore, when land hungry physical projects would show up, such as highways through the 1950s or large-scale housing projects or industrial facilities, they would go to the places where the land was the least expensive, right? That's urban economics 101 in many ways. And what we see is those historically disinvested places end up having a larger proportion of asphalt, concrete, impervious surface as a result of what had happened for decades, or what had happened decades earlier. So that lack of parks and green space in some neighborhoods, in this case, is not by coincidence or circumstance. It really is something that we can tie back, at least in an association correlational context, to specific sets of policies that were promulgated in the 1930s and on. When we look more recently from 1980 to 2020, and we look at the same neighborhoods. So this is a set of graphs of West Coast cities, Los Angeles, Oakland, Portland, Berkeley, and Sacramento. We see that these A, B, C, and D, keep in mind the C and D neighborhoods are the ones that were least invested in the 20th century. And as a result, what we see is that the population change, which is a very simple measure that we can use for the number of people living in those neighborhoods and how much that's changed from 1980 to 2020, we can see that in those 40 years that the C and D neighborhoods across these West Coast cities, we've subsequently done this across the country, have increased proportionally more than the A or B neighborhoods. And so what we're essentially seeing is a lot more of the development, often the multifamily residential development, going to the C and D neighborhoods around this city, as well as other cities around the West Coast, as well as the country. For me, that was a really interesting kind of data point, and these are percentages on the y-axis here. They're not, 0.1 represents, in this case, 10% increase in population, whereas 0.4 represents, for example, 40% increase in population. So in some cases, the A and B neighborhoods declined in population, in this case in Berkeley and Sacramento, whereas in Portland, while the A neighborhood also increased in population, the C and D neighborhoods clearly had a sign of about 18% C neighborhood and about a little over 13% or about 13% increase in the D neighborhood. So again, just a data point to suggest that when we're developing, what the punchline here is, when we're developing multifamily residential, there's a higher likelihood based on these data that that multifamily residential will go to historically disinvested areas of town. Maybe not a surprise, though worth thinking about. So what does this development look like, and how do we make some sense out of it? I wanted to just touch on a few changes that are very noticeable. If those graphs don't make too much sense, then these are some examples of what's happening around town when you see it from airplane flying over our head. We would see from 2014 to 2019 changes in the in many of these land uses. This is an area out this is an area in Northeast Portland. Some other images of areas in Southeast Portland where you see on the left side 2014 image and on the right side a 2019 image, essentially taking it of the same area. You see how this multifamily residential development is being is essentially going lot edge to lot edge in some of these cases. We're seeing several buildings taken down and new buildings put up. We're also seeing a lot of tree canopy being removed and land cleared for that development. And there's a lot of these kind of much of this is happening around the warehouses and kind of distribution centers. Though, as these images will show, these older neighborhoods are also being kind of raised and redesigned and redeveloped in terms of new developments going in. And so we're seeing that, I'm sure, around you all the time. And these are just, again, data points and patterns that I'm observing, in this case, from high above us as to what's actually happening on the landscape. All this is happening at a time where we're also encountering a rapid shift in our climate system on a planetary basis that plays out in many ways on the local basis. The asphalt that we're putting down, the buildings that we're putting up, the shifts of green space that we're doing on a daily basis around the region is really coming at a time where our temperatures are warming up and the amount of rain and cloud bursts that are occurring are increasing as well. And this is a direct result of the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that are currently in the atmosphere, and the climate models are remarkably consistent in their ability to identify shifts happening on a planetary scale. They're not so great at being able to say when an event is going to happen in what place, though we have experienced that here in the Pacific Northwest quite recently and quite dramatically. This particular heat event, this slide shows that essentially a number of hospitalizations and emergency department visits that happened when a massive heat dome that happened almost exactly to the day 4 years ago and happened on started on June 26th, which is 2 weeks from today. And we had an anomaly of about 20 degrees above the average temperature heat dome that showed up here. For many of you who are in the region, you experienced this probably firsthand if you stepped outside. I know I went with my family to the river nearby. We don't have air conditioning. And I remember putting my body fully submerged into a river and feeling like the air was pulling the moisture out of my eyeballs, which were the only things exposed at the time. It was viscerally hot. It was incredibly dangerous, where we saw the most number of deaths happen over a short period of time for any climate disaster in history in the Pacific Northwest that we know of. And this was recorded. It broke the climate models because they were not expecting such an event of this magnitude to occur here. Nevertheless, those models have improved and we're kind of learning as we go. So the climate system is undergoing some pretty rapid shifts in this process, and we're seeing some local implications of that broader planetary shift. We looked at the implications for housing based on this heat dome, and we were able to find, for example, that the majority of people who died were in multifamily residential developments. So those are what we were talking about, that we're building more and more of in the region, and that others who had died were in older, smaller, single-family residential developments, as well as mobile homes and RV parks, were other consistent patterns we were seeing in terms of the deaths that occurred. These are death from a heat wave is a very blunt measure as well. The primary the primary kind of mode of demographic that died was an older adult in this, usually an older male adult, usually an older male identifying as white adult in this particular case. And so, and often lower income as well. So it was a set of demographics we were able to pull from this. And when you look a little bit more closely, we were able to see that this distribution is also not coincident. I have some animation on these slides, but it's not working right now. So we've been mapping heat across the region for a long time. The map on the left shows a distribution, a very high resolution distribution of air temperatures in the city of Portland. And the map on the right shows places where people died from that heat wave in the city of Portland. The darker the color on the map on the right for the city, the more people died, in this case up to 3 to 4 people in those very dark or black areas, dark blue, black areas. And the lighter the shade, the fewer the people that died. Those neighborhoods overlapped pretty consistently with some of the heat mapping work we have done in the past, where we were able to show the relationship between people who have coping capacity, like higher incomes, and then others who are potentially more vulnerable from these heat waves. So the housing precarity combined with these extreme heat events, combined with some other built environment factors, really led to this particular set of fatalities. One additional data point I want to point to here is this work that we did recently. If you keep your eye on the map on the left here of where the people died, and then you look at the landscape change in terms of loss of tree canopy, I couldn't not see this once I spent a little time looking closely at the pattern between the darker purple areas are the places where most of the tree, where the highest proportion of tree canopy was lost in the city between 2014 and 2020. So over this 6 to 7 year period, the areas in purple lost the most canopy and the areas in green gained the most canopy. And so what we're seeing essentially is a pattern, in my view here, of right before the heat dome occurred in 2020, those same neighborhoods saw the greatest amount of development, saw the greatest amount of loss of tree canopy, and as a result, one could argue saw the greatest amount of fatalities. That's a kind of that's kind of a logic chain that I'm drawing, though again, it's correlational, not causation. It's really a series of data points, the best data we can gather to draw that connection between the development patterns, the way the development is occurring, the changes in the built environment, loss of shade structures in this case, amplification of temperatures, and an extreme event coming through. Just for context, this particular data point in Portland, I had a graduate student take this and look at the similar relationship in 33 other cities across the country where we could get good data. And we looked at the hottest neighborhoods in these 33 cities and the coolest neighborhoods in these 33 cities to see where was tree canopy coming down. Because in Portland, it seemed to, the pattern seemed to suggest that tree canopy was being lost in the hottest neighborhoods. And no surprise, we saw that there was the greatest loss of tree canopy in the hottest neighborhoods. I probably don't have time to get into this graphic too much, but the basic point of this is on the left side is a graph of the coolest neighborhoods in these 33 cities, and the right graph is the hottest neighborhoods in these 33 cities. And the blue color is loss of tree canopy, and the orange color is gain of tree canopy. And if you blur your eyes just right, you will see that the map or the graph on the right has a great deal of blue, right? And we've quantified this as well, and we've done some statistical analysis on this, and we're finding that the hottest neighborhoods across these 33 cities are the ones losing the greatest tree canopy, likely to greater amounts of development happening in those areas as well. So I want to maybe just touch on one other thing here, and um, that is just one more kind of piece of data, I guess, and research that might help inform some of our conversation. And that is when you take a neighborhood like this one in Northeast Portland and you ask a question of what would happen if we were to up zone these neighborhoods, meaning we want to go from 16 um, single family residential structures to 64 units. We need housing in the city. We have established that. Nevertheless, we go from 16 units to 64 units. The planners wanted to know, can we do that without amplifying the heat, without raising temperatures? Because we know infrastructure will amplify temperatures. And we used essentially a computational model, a computer model, to simulate what would happen in this neighborhood that had 16 units to 64 units. And this was several years back, working with the city design team. And we took, you can arrange 64 units of development in a variety of different ways, right? And so we took 7 different scenarios of development and evaluated how much would temperatures change as a result of upzoning this particular city block in Northeast Portland. So what we did was, in this case, we took these different scenarios of development. One is the gray is the development, the green is green space, the black is asphalt, and the orange is grass, basically. And we took the existing base case, Plan 1, which is on the bottom right here, and we tried arranging the buildings in different ways. We put the buildings all together, we spread them apart, we created a horseshoe design. In the upper right, we created a design where we essentially did, as we have since the 1950s, a horseshoe and slapped a asphalt parking lot in the middle. And what we were finding in terms of the heat differences, this is in Celsius here, what we're finding is this Plan 6B, the one in the upper right here, where it's basically a multifamily residential development with an asphalt parking spot in the middle. We're finding that that one raised the temperature by about 3 degrees Celsius, roughly about 6 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit. There was another example of Plan 6S where we had essentially lightened the roofs. We had even lightened the roads surrounding it. This is Japan and a few other places are doing this, lightening the roads by introducing some lighter aggregate into the road materials, as well as put a large kind of green space patch in the middle with some medium form trees in the middle of that. And we were finding that we could, in fact, with the Plan 6S, design a multifamily residential development, increasing the units from 16 to 64, while also keeping temperatures at or below the temperatures of pre-higher density levels. So what we were able to do is kind of come up with this computationally. Now what I'm trying to do in the next chapter of this work that I'm getting involved with a bit more, and this is probably too much information for this conversation, but I'll just kind of maybe seed this as something to think about for the next few, for our conversation. And so let me just, before I go there, let me just back up. So we have a history of development that's occurred. We're seeing that development really drive a lot of shifts in the land use from lower density to higher density. We're seeing those higher densities change the built environment. We're seeing those areas that are hotter get the development and amplify temperatures in those neighborhoods. And now we're seeing the loss of shade structures. And finally, this last bit that I'm ending, or at least touching on here, is that we can design differently. We can put together these configurations of development in a way that actually doesn't continue to amplify temperatures and may bring more to that particular city block than just higher temperatures and a lot less parking and other things that people are concerned about. So that's kind of where we are. So where we're headed is we don't have really very good ways to communicate to landscape architects, to urban designers, developers, what the implications are of different types of designs and development in a particular location. So what we're trying to develop as one way to do this, we do this for stormwater, we do this for air pollution, we don't do this for temperature yet. And as temperatures continue to warm and as we're heading into summer here, I just want to put this in front of you. This is an open concept where I'm exploring a development of an index where I'm trying to develop something that with a team that allows us to communicate a bit more clearly to a developer or a planner what are design characteristics that would help in maintaining or even reducing temperatures on a site. And we've been able to draw on the literature to narrow down about 5 different design features that seem to matter when it comes to improving the thermal comfort of a place. And it ranges from things like microtopography, these are technical terms, but microtopography, to things like the overall context of a place. So it goes from the even minuscule little things of creating, for example, greater roughness in a site, where when you get a little more roughness as opposed to a solid piece of cement or asphalt, those areas tend to absorb the heat and retain it for longer, whereas the roughness, you'll notice a lot of buildings in the desert have a higher level of roughness on them, like the stucco designs, for example. They tend to shade, they tend to deflect, they tend to be a bit better when it comes to the shortwave solar radiation being absorbed by these materials. And so we're taking this kind of thermal comfort index idea and trying to think about it in terms of different places and how to apply something like this, where if you have places that amplify temperatures, they would get a rating of 80 to 100, for example. Or if places that stay cool throughout the day and night would get a lower thermal landscape comfort score. And so we're spending some time trying to unpack this and applying it to various different locations. We're applying it to things like the park blocks and this isn't the park blocks, but promenades and such, where we're able to understand what a thermal comfort would be in this particular site, or what a thermal comfort would be in this, what used to be a freeway in Seoul, South Korea, that was daylit. And in a massive effort of municipal engineering, that freeway was torn up, and the river or creek that was flowing underneath was daylit and now has become a big attraction. So I'm watching these things happen around the world. Recently, I had a chance to go to Medellin in Colombia, South America, and there's a number of other design elements that are showing up around the city as well. And these are adaptive reuse. Like these structures were already here, and they're finding ways to integrate different forms of green space, different forms of art, different forms of cooling for a space that's continuing to heat up. And so I want to just kind of leave you with this to think about. We've covered a lot of ground, and I'm really curious as to how, as you think about design charrettes and as you think about ways to build resilience into the city, how do we recognize those historical landscapes, those historical designs, that historical kind of policy and culture that is in a place, and combine that with aspects of a changing climate, which are going to throw a lot more intense and frequent extreme events at us, and how do we then see ourselves within a community, and so that we can really build that resilience together. So with that, let me just close out and leave you with a few data points to think about and a few concepts to ponder as we kind of get set up for the late June, what I would call your design charrette happening on the anniversary of the heat dome as well. So I'll leave it at that. Stop sharing my screen unless there are questions related to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vivek. I have a couple questions and then I'd love to open it up to other people too. I think one thing that we had talked about was that I was hoping you might be able to share was also something I had learned in one of your previous presentations, which you had brought up, was about the building form of how different building heights were affecting trapping air quality pollution. So not just heat, but also just all these other factors associated with health and livability, and then also temperatures related to loss of tree canopy and increased aggression and violence and crime and things like that. Could you speak a little bit to the building form and those other health impacts?
Yeah, so I had a really talented graduate student back in like 2015 who was he was a real data scientist person, and he was interested in trying to undertake a very rich data set called it's called LIDAR, light detection and ranging. It's like radar, except with light. And he took this massive data set of 14 terabytes of data and essentially just created a three-dimensional digital description of the city. And what he was able to do is overlay on that our heat data and then start looking for associations between different neighborhood typologies. We created these we created a dozen different neighborhood typologies and looked at what were the factors that were amplifying temperatures in those, what were design factors that were amplifying temperatures. And one of the interesting results that he was able to pick up he wrote a master's thesis on this, was that when you change building heights, like when buildings are higher and lower in the same neighborhood, it allows for greater circulation of air in that neighborhood and in that city block. And as opposed to when you have two buildings that are essentially roughly the same height, especially if they're taller, they tend to trap that air and hold it there and bake it in, and it ends up amplifying temperatures in those areas. And so in those neighborhoods that had greater diversity of building heights, it was a very simple correlation that he was able to pull out, showing that there was actually cooler temperatures associated to that variety of building heights. It kind of goes back to Jane Jacobs and several other folks who were talking about kind of the neighborhoods that had a great deal of diversity in them, both culturally as well as from a built environment perspective.
Absolutely. I think it's really fascinating. And also what you were talking about is sort of like building roughness too, the texture of the buildings. A lot of our buildings, just sort of thinking about what are the sort of lessons we might learn from these historic buildings and neighborhoods, built with a lot of natural materials, which have that built-in natural roughness, brick and stone and wood, those kind of things. A lot of our building materials now are sort of these more synthetic materials that are very smooth, but also not very durable. And so I was thinking about that, but also maybe a lot of courtyard developments, a lot of porches. And so maybe there's a lot of lessons, it seems like, that we could be learning from our longstanding kind of timeless building designs. That how can we, I think we're going to be talking about this more as we go forward with some of our exhibits on, we're going to be working on a hidden density exhibit. What are those lessons from older buildings that we don't even notice as dense because they're really well designed? A lot of the beautiful courtyard developments that we see in Northwest and throughout Portland, often that also has a contributing connection with cooler design too, and more livability, more air and light, things like that. So I'm wondering, are there other things related to the built form of our environment that we might be thinking of?
Yeah. I mean, I have my own, at least admitted biases. I tend to think about green space in cities and, the access to shade and parks um, yeah, yeah, growing up in the California redwoods and just recognizing how much my particular bias to green space, but I mean, when in my work in the Middle East, for example, where we were working in some places that had been there for thousands of years, and they were developed in the heat. They were developed in the desert, and we were able to learn a great deal about simple design techniques, such as that roughness, such as coloring of buildings, such as the quality of roof and kind of what's done with roofs, as well as kind of these small, for example, passageways for allowing the air to move more effectively. Often what we're seeing now in a lot of these Middle East cities where I'm observing rapid development is these massive designs of buildings that are right on the waterfront, right? And developers will put those up there. I'm thinking about some of those that went up right on the waterfront of the Willamette River, for example, that essentially what that does is when you have water and land, there's a natural breeze because of the change in pressure and air pressure. There's a breeze that actually takes that cooler air from that water onto the land. And when you put a building up right there, what it effectively does is block that breeze. And so all the potentially downwind developments or people living there would be blocked from that cool breeze blowing through. And you see the amplification of temperatures just what would be downwind. And so when we're citing these developments on, for example, waterways, making them these big kind of block walls, in a sense, blocking walls is one of the more challenging kind of conversations I've had, in part because developers want to put those up. They get the higher premiums for the water view, and they want to have the balcony, and they want to do this. And I'm thinking, wow, well, you're doing that in light of a trade-off that you're doing on this site for all the people who are going to be impacted just immediately adjacent and downwind. So I think about those kinds of simple yet difficult conversations to have, because the data are pointing to several different design considerations that we need to be integrating better into our code as well. Right now, none of that is really, from what I can see, part of a code that recognizes that the climate is warming and that we need to be doing a bit more. I'm hoping my time on the Sustainability and Climate Commission will help at least move some of those conversations a bit more directly.
That's fantastic. I'm so glad you're part of that. And I want to open it up for other people's questions. And I'm going to put a link in the chat also to the design charrette, so people can learn more if they want to come to the public sessions. But what are other people, are there any questions? I see Sam Goldberg has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the really fantastic presentation. There's one story that has really stuck with me. I want to make sure it's properly attributed. I'm pretty sure I first read about it in Happy City by Charles Montgomery, about the study of the Chicago heat wave in the 90s and how and obviously, correlation, not causation, but the single biggest predictor of why people died or didn't was how many social connections they had, how many close relationships they had. And I'm wondering if that has been any piece of research that you've kind of pulled on, looking at how urban design makes us more resilient, and incorporating that social connection aspect.
Yeah, it's a really great question, Samuel. I'm a big, I mean, I went into planning, urban planning, in part because of this exact question of trying to understand that my little background is I came from a place where people were constantly outside in South Asia, where people we were always outside talking. There was a physical environment that would allow for these congregations to happen and these meeting places to happen, both serendipitously and intentionally. And when we moved to the US when I was 10, I immediately felt so isolated because the way the suburbs were designed were for you to be in your car and not to ever talk to anyone. And so notions of kind of density are really helpful when it comes to social interactions and connections. Though that kind of density, as we've seen, can also lend itself to amplifying temperatures in a neighborhood. So what I'm trying to do is thread a needle between these, or among many different factors, but at least in basic sense, between the ability to provide housing and increase housing availability for residents who might be unhoused, and at the same time recognize that we're also fighting a clock that is just ramping up temperatures year by year. And so what is the role that design plays in being able to thread that needle in terms of providing the housing, ensuring that we have housed populations, at the same time recognizing that there are certain design characteristics of that housing that we need to be keeping in place, and codifying so that we allow for that climate to be mitigated. It might not get at your question, but I think what that density does, if it's done well, is it cools that neighborhood, keeps it well, but also allows people to lean on each other during these extreme events as well. And seeing ourselves as part of that community is a big part of it. Trying to push Home Forward, City of Portland's housing provider, subsidized housing provider, to think about, for example, resilience hubs within their homes and within their buildings, and figuring out what will it take to encourage people to actually connect in their own buildings, so that when events do show up, there's greater resilience through the helping out of one another in these places.
Thank you. That was a great question. And also thinking about, those other design elements like balconies. So if you are going to have denser places, what are those places that you can also be seeing each other and connecting? If you're talking about courtyards, but also those front porches and things like that, that might spark conversations with your neighbors, or you see people, or, just even having, more tree canopy so that it's more walkable, that you might end up with those connections. Even just seeing people, regardless of whether you start a conversation, you're connecting with people. And so I love that we're thinking about those. What are those metrics or tools that we need? I think that is really relevant to what we're going to be thinking about in terms of the design charrette that's coming up on the 27th and 28th. And I'm wondering, I think we could take one more question. I see Dan's got his hand up.
Oh, thank you. We need more housing and more density. And the only lens that I really get to have is Portland. And it seems as if there's sort of an attitude of you're either for us or against us. And if you're you need to be for density on our terms. And I wonder, with your broader perspective and your connection with other cities, do you see ways for us to hold on to the qualities that make our city resilient? How do we hold on to those qualities while also responding to the push for density, like don't get in our way, and all that?
Yeah, I wish I had more than 30 seconds for this.
We could take a little bit more time if you're able to.
It is at the core of it. How do you maintain some of the things that we really cherish and hold on to, and at the same time recognize that there's a real big push for greater density housing, etc. I guess one of the quick responses is I've become much more enamored with notions of with ideas of design for gathering places and places where people can come together. This is both a kind of a very traditional old idea, and it's something that I think we've really done away with. When I go to a lot of multifamily residential buildings and I tour them as part of the Urban Land Institute program that I'm involved with, I see just they're like hallways with just doors on all of them. They're in a tiny little area for entering the building, and I'm really kind of surprised at how little space, and it's, of course, my guess is that it's economically driven, but how little space there is for gathering, or a little space there is for taking some refuge from things that are, like in my world, wildfire smoke that's going to emerge, and if you don't have an air purifier or the HVAC system or an AC in your unit, how do you get to a place? So one of the big things I'm really thinking about a lot are these resilience hubs, these gathering places, where people can make connections, as Samuel was asking about, as well as trying to get information about ways to stay safe during extreme events. I mean, that's an easy one for me, but there's so many other, I'm sure within even this group, we could probably identify several other ways to be able to hold on to those kind of places and opportunities that we do appreciate and like, and yet at the same time expand the housing opportunity and development.
Thank you so much. I wish we had a little bit more time, and I think that there's some, let's see, we maybe have some questions. There's a link in the chat to our design charrette if you want to register for that. I know Brad was asking about whether the Pearl District is successful in threading the needle.
Yep, that's a tricky one. The Pearl has done a lot of things amazingly well. I mean, I really like the buried. I really like the buried lines, like telephone lines buried. There's several features that I really appreciate, because part of the other concern is urban fires, and that's something that with exposed lines and things like that, with places like Forest Park, Powell Butte, et cetera, that I'm thinking about a lot. That shows up. But in terms of the actual buildings themselves, there are some buildings like the Armory, and there are certainly older buildings there that I think have some incredible design features. I'm not an architect, so I can't speak in great detail about those facade articulation details and things like that. But I do think there is a great deal of movement of air across the Pearl. We've actually measured that. We know that there's quite a bit of air movement. There's a movement towards green space. There's a few parks, not a lot of parks in the Pearl, but a few green spaces in the Pearl, including water features. I have measured some reflections coming off of buildings from these large glass towers that are near the Pearl, not necessarily right in the Pearl, but these glass towers that when the sun is just at the right angle, it is hitting the ground, and the ground is 190 degrees. And it is enough to burn your hand if you put it on the ground during a hot day. And there are things about what we're working with in terms of sun, heat, wind, reflection, for example, that the Pearl didn't quite get, and other things that just, I think, totally by happenstance and coincidence works, right? So it's kind of like, it's an area of study. I would love to dig into that, Brad, a bit more and see if there are ways to apply the like thermal comfort index and things like that to a specific neighborhood like the Pearl.
And I appreciate that Alina put in the chat also, the wall of waterfront development is a hot topic in many cities, and that Toronto has some thoughtful design guidelines developed after a wall of waterfront apartments had already been built, causing the city behind to have greater overheating. And there's a link in the chat there too. I think this is really relevant to what we're talking about today, and the power of design to really influence how livable our city is, and what we can learn from the buildings that we have already, how we might be able to leverage that more instead of kind of putting all of our eggs in a new development basket. We have lots of vacant buildings downtown. How might we be leveraging those for adaptive reuse, reducing the emissions of extractive material, and refining of those materials, transporting those materials, the demolition, that all has a very significant impact. And I'll just share a last couple slides with folks that I just wanted to remind people about, is that what we're working on here at the Architectural Heritage Center is really bringing these important conversations that we can be convening this thought leadership. And so as we think about what kind of city we want to make, we need to be raising our design literacy so that we can have a much deeper conversation than just, are we going to build or not build? you know, it's going to happen, but how we do it is so critical. And so I appreciate that you're bringing that attention to the resiliency and design connection. Particularly, we have a couple projects that are happening right now that are at risk. We have two wonderful historic buildings that are posed for demolition, and as major climate impacts of that, as well as loss of cultural importance and heritage, and unnecessary demolition when there's existing vacant land. Should we be really using, losing 200 units of housing in a housing crisis and a climate crisis? And the climate analysis that we did was a really significant impact of, savings of 72 to almost 90% of the carbon emissions if they were to retrofit these buildings. It's the equivalent of 5 million pounds of coal being burned. So how might we, be more thoughtful about that? And so we have a webinar coming up on June 18th as well. It's both the history and importance of these buildings, but also, how we can advocate and be thinking more mindfully about leveraging the resources we have both downtown for maybe for converting to existing housing or to additional housing, but also thinking about what are those tools that we need, like a state rehabilitation tax credit that 39 other states have. And, we don't have that tool that could help us with other housing conversions, addressing other seismic issues or energy upgrades. We also don't have some of the financial tools we might need for adding that density within our residential areas without demolition. So we need those, those technical tools, low interest loans, fast track permitting, fee waivers, those policy tools that we may not be thinking about in addition to. And then what are those places that have that connectivity and, that become our sort of mini downtowns that we're losing, our main streets right now. So I want to invite people to sign up for our Design Charrette public review sessions and also the reception. And then also want to let people know that they can get involved with the Architectural Heritage Center. You can subscribe to our newsletter, and you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram and learn more about us here. So I'm just going to put a link in the chat to our other webinar that's happening, that's on the PSU Advocacy, and give you an opportunity to learn more about that as well. We've got a great series of events coming up and exhibits. So I want to just thank everybody for being here today, and I want to thank Vivek for all of his time and support and having these important conversations that we really need to be having as we think about what kind of city we want to foster for greater livability, health, and caring for the historic resources that we have today that can be part of that climate solution. So thank you so much, everyone. And this will be recorded. We'll put that on the same webpage that's linked in the chat, and we'll send you all a copy. Thanks so much. Appreciate you.